Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It's Friday, September 1st, 2023. It's a new month, and I don't know. I guess we just wait around for very September-ish things to happen, and it looks like from the looks of the weather forecast that it will be very un-September-like, I guess, at the beginning of next week. But we're getting used to these ideas of these outrageous heat waves, totally incongruous with the seasons in which they occur. I guess it's still summer, technically, but now it being September, much of the northeastern seaboard, anyway, expects weather to cool at this point, but instead it will skyrocket, and it looks like we are on tap for a couple of 100-degree days in this area next week, which, okay, I guess it's not entirely out of keeping. We've certainly have hot weather into October around here fairly frequently, and I expect it'll only get worse these days. And we're all having to deal with these weather anomalies, but there you have it. It's not yet up to that level. We got a few pleasant days left, and then, of course, the big holiday weekend, Labor Day weekend. Spoke to Greg a little bit about it yesterday after his appearance on the show. We feel, I think, collectively that it's absolutely necessary to honor the Labor Day tradition, which is, I don't know what our Labor Day tradition has been, but I guess you're not supposed to labor on Labor Day, oddly enough. Those of you who understand the provenance of the holiday understand exactly why. So, what we'll do with Monday remains to be seen, but we'll fix something up and occupy that airspace with something, whether it's a throwback episode or something like that. And there's always plenty of material that we could be sharing with you. The question is, will we be able to find time over the weekend to record it? I don't know. All right, time to kick things off. John Shiflett knows that's the case and has done so already this morning with his daily Mastodon toot. Are we sticking with each platform having its own word for it? You can't really call it a tweet, although maybe that terminology is up for grabs now that they've changed the name of Twitter to X. That's something where they should actually explore that and say everybody else grab all of the things that could have been copyrighted but probably weren't, and there's really no reason to worry about calling your posts on your microblogging site tweets, given that, well, like Band-Aids, right? I mean, that became sort of a generic terminology for bandages, adhesive bandages. So you can grab that now that they're calling themselves X. Anyway, what has he sent out? It's notice, of course, that we are live. And what does he have for today? Sometimes he brings up, he loves to check the daily calendars, too. Find out what national day it might be, especially if it's absurdist sounding. And what do we have today? This one brought to you by No Rhyme Nor Reason Day. Is that an actual day? A day to celebrate words like orange and spirit that do not rhyme with any other words in the English language. I didn't realize that they had to have. To me, every day is No Rhyme Nor Reason Day, just like Children's Day, and there's really no reason to mark it, but I don't want to look like I'm, bigoted against those words or something like that, right? I think that's what usually happens when you deny that somebody needs a particular day or recognition of some kind. Let's see, Justice says that he's calling it. I've seen a lot of people calling it this in print. The problem is I don't know what to say with how to pronounce it on radio. Like, zitter, it's, X instead of the TW from Twitter. And it has a connotation. And, there's other words with which it might rhyme, which would call for the censoring horn, for instance. And you can say it that way, right? The X is sometimes, in some languages anyway, pronounced that way with a sort of a zh or a, anyway, so jitter. Can we get away with that one? I think so. Anyway, so he figures a post should be called a poop, and that feels right. I think. But yeah, I'm stuck with that tweet terminology, and I don't know what it is. It's easy, and it doesn't require any more thinking, and it steals from Elon Musk in some way that he can't actually enforce legally, and I think that would be great. Okay, so let's see. Other things happening today. There are lots of things that have fallen by the wayside in Pocket that we should get to and read through. I feel like there was something. Were we reading in the middle of something yesterday and we didn't make it all the way through? I think there was. And we often feel like obligated to get all the way through those things. And it might have been. Oh yeah, right. Oh right, that's true. It was this is where we'll start. We'll start and get this one out of the way. This was the very interesting, I thought, article on Russian disinformation practices and how they have been taking root not only, around the world and in different ways, but with less resistance than usual, less resistance offered, less resistance available, even if people want to resist, in Africa for various reasons. Not the least of which is that there's traditionally been a presence by the Soviet Union and then later Russia in this particular, in all areas, but all over Africa, but I guess in this region in particular, which was a new regional terminology introduced yesterday, the Sahel, I guess, if I've learned to pronounce that correctly or not. We still don't know, but Sahelian Africa, that is to say, not all of sub-Saharan Africa, but just that strip, that transitional strip from what would be like the southern Sahara and then into the rest of the continent. But it stretches all the way across from east to west. And so, occupying territory of some dozen nations across the way. Anyway, that area of particular interest because of its rich mineral resources, and not just obscure mineral resources either. Apparently, very rich in gold resources, which the Russians are snapping up and using to buy weapons on the international market to pursue their war in Ukraine, and also just to have some gold in pocket to do other mischief with later on. So something that's completely off of most typical Americans, I think, foreign policy radar. Foreign policy is off their radar in general, but this in particular. So interesting to turn to the foreign policy experts who keep an eye on things like this in the foreign service and foreign policy community, where they all know what you're talking about when you talk about Sahelian Africa and exactly why, because they're brilliant, exactly, or repositories of useless knowledge, which I recognize as a kind of brilliance. They know exactly what's up when you say, sure, the Russians are interested in Sahelian Africa, and here's what they're doing to try to grab up what there is to grab there. So I think we left off here. Perhaps, we might have been reading about the particular vulnerability of Africa to Russian active measures, and why, I don't know, or why they've had a traditional interest in it. Of course, a lot of active measures have been used in places that we're perhaps more familiar with, fragmenting Western Europe, as they say, through these active measures, some clandestine, we read this yesterday, some quite visible, that is to say, favoring separatist movements, such as those in Catalonia, Basque country, Scotland, Wales, Veneto, Sicily, right? And then the other one that I didn't know how to pronounce, Vojvodina, perhaps, Vojvodina. I know, again, nothing about that one. And let's I like to look these things up as we're doing it. What will Wikipedia tell me about it? Officially an autonomous province that occupies the northernmost part of Serbia, in case you were wondering exactly what are we talking about here. So different, I suppose, ethnicities there. What is the ethnicity in the area? It says Serbs make up the absolute majority in most municipalities, except in, where is this? Subotica, the second largest city, oh boy, which has a mixed population with no absolute majority of any nation, but the Serbian language is spoken by a plurality there too. All right, so apologies for all of the bad pronunciation, but all of the foreign policy whizzes know what's going on here. Now, this section here, which I thought was important, we didn't get to yesterday, I think. Russian inroads in Africa. In Africa, Russia gets an extra advantage in its destabilization programs. We did mention this, I think. Military dictatorships warmly welcome their military materiel and brutal tactics in putting down civic unrest. Democracies are unstable to begin with and easily undermined. Resentment of colonial history, especially of the French in the Francophone Sahel and Central Africa, are now more apparent than ever. And the West's inability to challenge these encroachments of civic space. Western governments cite efforts that they make, it's in scare quotes here, to reverse this process, but search in vain for a method of doing so. And remember, a big thrust of this article is this guy thinks that he has some ideas about how we might use non-governmental organizations to combat this disinformation. Recent expansion of the BRICS Club. Remember, we did make mention of BRICS. That's the sort of alliance of sorts, alignment anyway, that's emerged as between, let's see if we can remember all the BRICS. Are we talking about Brazil, right? Maybe Russia, India, China, and South Africa, if I remember correctly. The recent expansion of the BRICS Club on August 24th, now to include Egypt and Ethiopia, as well as South Africa, shows understandable new African policies to decouple from Western alliances and friendships. The policies have logic, but create space where Russia can move in easily. Well, especially if they're in with the BRICS Club. But okay, you get the idea. As various countries around the world look to decouple from their Western alliances, where will they be looking? To someone else who can provide them with the material and assistance that they need. African leaders are suckered into believing the anachronism that Soviet assistance for independence movements during the Cold War somehow relates to the Russian Federation of today, which in fact has largely abandoned Soviet objectives and values. I could see that easily being the case, right? Well, traditionally, we've gone to the Russians when we wanted to distance ourselves from Western powers. And the old Soviet regime helped us out with all sorts of things, usually, to stick it to the West and to incur or to, what's the word we want to use here? Well, anyway, to enjoy the benefits of having a good relationship with our country and being able to extract whatever value they can from it on their behalf. They would be able to also deny it to the West. So it makes good sense. They'll probably do it again. The Russian people, whatever. They have this interest for whatever reasons. But they do, and they're pretty much self-motivated, just as the Soviet reasons probably were. But there was also an overarching ideology to the Soviet assistance that probably doesn't exist with the Russian existence. It's more simply exploitative, though certainly the desire to stick it to everybody else. I think they've retained that. But that's not supposed to be a good motivation. Anyway, good point, right? African leaders are suckered into believing, everybody is really suckered into believing that the anachronism that Soviet assistance had during the Cold War somehow relates to what the Russian Federation of today would be doing. There is no mystery to how Russian disinformation themes and memes move vigorously into this newly opened space. Effective propaganda cites arguments that have some basis in truth, the kernel of truth that we always look for, right? Try to figure out where did this even come from. The outright lie is more persuasive when mixed with exaggerated truths. True, the Soviet Union supported insurgencies in colonial Africa, and it's true that the colonizing countries exploited their African, quote, possessions. Beyond that, outright lies state that the United States is destabilizing food supplies, and America and NATO are provoking conflict with Russia. Russian disinformation masters are not fools. Current Kremlin narratives ably spark subliminal overtones matching Pan-African and anti-colonial sentiments of the 1960s and 70s. These intentionally distorted parallels are further outsourced to social media influencers like pro-Putin Kemi Seba and anti-French Natalie Yamb. I guess two activists in various parts of Africa. There's some links here to their Wikipedia profiles if you'd like to know who they are and where they're working and why. We know that Russia is not the Soviet Union, but who in Africa cares? I'm not certain they give the Africans a tremendous amount of credit in this, but I think they I think they don't. But it may certainly be a valid question. Does anybody in Africa who's looking for any kind of assistance particularly care what the current Russian ideology is as compared to where it was during the Soviet days? Not if they're looking for material help and getting it and looking to distance themselves from the West. They'll get it, but it comes at a price. But it came with a price from the Soviets too, so it's not that they don't care or that they don't know, it's that it doesn't make any particular difference, perhaps. Anyway, South Africa President Cyril Ramaphosa, who I don't know and probably should because it's a major player in world affairs, and yet here I am, now engages in joint military exercises with the Russian military and gives a pass to Russia's malicious policies elsewhere. Ramaphosa's, is it Ramaphosa? Ramaphosa? I don't know. Ramaphosa's dust-up on May 11th with U.S. Ambassador Ruben Brigitte, whose name I also don't know, and he's the U.S. ambassador, so I'm an equal opportunity not knower, who spoke of South African weapons shipments to Russia, has left South Africans in doubt and some in disbelief. Some observers in South Africa found Brigitte's, is that right, Brigitte's assertions credible, and are now putting Ramaphosa's government under increased scrutiny. That said, subliminal gratitude to the Soviet Union for its support of the African National Congress during South Africa's apartheid period may be apples and oranges. The history now has elements of obsolescence, but still has teeth. If you care about conflict in Eastern Europe and are willing to overlook challenges in Africa, know this: UN General Assembly votes to condemn Russia's actions in Ukraine are wobbly in Africa. Of abstentions and no votes condemning Russia's actions in Ukraine on February 24th, 2022, I guess one of the last General Assembly votes on it, half of those abstentions and no votes were African, or 17 out of 32. These numbers may seem fleeting in an international body of 193 members, but African resolve wanes with each succeeding vote. This is not a promising trend line and reflects enlightened self-interest, collusion in some cases, and a growing sense in Africa that European wars are not in their bailiwick. I can't blame them there. Too often Africans were dragged into them during colonial and Cold War times, and they will have it no more. If a United Nations General Assembly, or UNGA, vote ever falls short of a majority asking the Secretary General to establish a war crimes tribunal, then Russia gets a free pass for its crimes in Ukraine and elsewhere. Alarm bells should be going off while we slumber. Add coercion as a motive for African leaders in private conversations, we can well imagine this imagined quote: "We can help you greatly for a no vote, punish you hurtfully if you vote yes, and we'll be watching abstentions closely." That's not a great idea if a member of the permanent member of the Security Council is threatening people that way. But we're just imagining it. Maybe it's not happening. Military juntas in the Sahel and others calculate their interests reasonably, kowtow to a nuclear power that accounts for less than 1% of their bilateral trade? Perhaps today, yes, though maybe not forever. African leaders, too, are strategic thinkers. At last, some credit for African leaders. You may remember when shortwave and local radios were the main source of international news in Africa. No longer. Now virtually all Africans have local cell phone coverage, and 384 million are on social media regularly, a number comparable to the total of Voice of America listeners worldwide. So you can reach them as easily, if not more easily, via the internet than we were ever able to do with Voice of America. Civil society is booming in Africa, and with it, susceptibility to any source that reaches them. Russia Today, RT, right, the broadcast network, and its many trolls now physically inhabit the African space, with RT establishing an office and broadcasting entity in South Africa, and another on its way to Kenya. African civil society is not all that gullible, but the information they receive from Kremlin outlets currently drowns out other voices. VOA, BBC, and Deutsche Welle are, Welle, perhaps how you pronounce it, W-E-L-L-E. Germans, speak up. They are increasingly seen as fuddy-duddy or outdated. Never mind those broadcasters' scrupulous journalistic fact-checking. In addition, Wagner feeds off poorer countries where education levels and press funding are lacking. This leaves fertile ground for disinformation. Suhel, okay, some more pronunciation help from my remote production team. My mom, Suhel, Suhel, or is Sahel? Okay, it's S-A, but what can you do? All right, Suhel. There you go. Or Sahelian. Is that how we'll say it? I think we got that right. Anyway, so how do you like that? Younger, more savvy voices within Western governments have been pointing out this unchallenged aggression in recent years, that is, of RT and internet sources edging out the old school sources of Voice of America radio, BBC, etc. Younger, more savvy voices within Western governments have been pointing out this unchallenged aggression in recent years. The higher-ups in those governments have been unable or unwilling to respond to the call or to create effective mechanisms of response. You'd think that would be a fairly simple thing, too, right? I mean, every broadcast outlet in America has got an internet presence. Is there not a way for people to move from radio to internet presence instead? I'm sure VOA, BBC we know has print, or maybe it's just that fuddy-duddy fact-checking thing that makes you less nimble than people who are just willing to lie and make up their stories on the fly. They don't have to fact-check anything or hand it to an editor. I could see how you would always be behind on that. Russia knows what it is doing, the article continues. So do Western countries, sort of. The difference is that the latter merely examine, chart, diagram, monitor, decipher, study, write papers, and hold lectures. In other words, actually not a bad parallel to the what was it, the old Karl Rove quote about how Republicans create their own reality. Now, we didn't really understand exactly what that meant. It sounded like it was fanciful to create your own reality. But now Trump, I guess, has taught us exactly what it means to create your own reality. But that Democrats would, what was it the quote? We would study judiciously, as we do, study the actions of Republicans in creating their own reality and analyze it to death. And then, be able, I guess, eventually the upshot of this was we could prove definitively that it was a creation of their own mind and it just doesn't bear itself out in facts. But while we were putting together that blue ribbon panel to show everybody that we had been misinformed by the Republicans, they would have acted a second time and a third and a fourth and done more of the dumb crap that they love doing while we were busy analyzing how bad it was. Similar tactic, I guess, happening here. So I guess no mystery how it came to be that the super anti-communist, anti-Russian, Republican, right-wing American politicos ended up somehow becoming the biggest Russian cheerleaders and allies around. Okay, It's the same tactics, I suppose, being used. All right, so where were we? Admonishing the West for judiciously studying the act of creating their own reality over there in Russia. Little do they know. They do little. There we are. To enter the civic and information space where information war is taking place, that is Western countries. Lacking players on the field, you'll never win the game. Security protocols alone on U.S. government internet systems hamstring official efforts, even with inspired and inventive approaches from dedicated individuals. Understandably, the U.S. government must keep its internal internet connections secure. This is well and good, but limits the ability to enter social media platforms boldly. There is wisdom in outsourcing these activities to private and independent organizations which are free of such constraints. This arrangement is growing, and properly so, since non-governmental organizations can say and do things that governments can't. The trick is to maintain transparency while doing so and engage with under-the-radar programs that often backfire. Perilous understaffing in U.S. embassies in Africa, especially in public diplomacy staff, also limits the U.S. government's bandwidth in confronting the problem. Almost up to our break here. Let's fit in a little bit more and see if we can make some real progress on this article. For an Alice in Wonderland romp, oh my, this is changing speed here, check out the March 31st, 2023 concept of the Russian Federation's foreign policy. Does this make sense to anybody? Let's see. It reads like a U.S. national security strategy and touts virtues like multilateral institutions, like maybe the UN they're talking about, it says here, which serve as platforms for harmonizing the interest of the leading powers, and characterizes the rule-based world order as an imposition of rules, standards, and norms that have been developed without equitable participation of all interested states. It is a pretty good propaganda spin on the rule of law.
Hi, I'm Scott Anderson, the guy that writes the daily summary for this show, Kagro in the Morning. Thank you to everyone that supports this show. Many of you send donations through PayPal, Patreon, Square Cash, Radio Public, and so on. Some of you write your own essays and send them in, or read articles with your own commentary. We appreciate it. Now, some of you are listening to this and thinking, I'd like to help, but isn't there something I could do that wouldn't require money or effort? Why, yes, there is. You can just like us. On Daily Kos, they call it the recommend button. YouTube has a thumbs up. There are hearts and likes and love buttons. Tap our love button. Tap our love button every day. Share our shows and summaries on Facebook and Twitter, YouTube and iTunes, Stitcher and Amazon. Most of these places allow you to write a review, so a sentence or two would be great. Recommend us to social media, or tell your friends to listen to the show. You aren't just helping us, you're helping them find their new favorite thing to listen to. You could change the world. So thank you in advance from me and everybody else in the world.
All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Wow, well, this is a long article. We're making progress through it, but and there's lots of other more local political news that I do feel like we need to get to. We'll get there, but I do think that this is, I don't know, we use Friday for important looks at these stories that would otherwise escape our notice, and I think this is among them. Something to keep an eye on, even though it's not going to be a day-to-day preoccupation for most of us exactly combating Russian disinformation in Africa, but we're attuned to the idea or the need to combat it here. But it's of interest, obviously, that it's at work and working very well, apparently, around the world. So we left off with this look at a Russian Federation foreign policy concept paper, essentially, that made inroads into, well, you could see how it might work, especially in the anti-colonialist circles, that, hey, by the way, these, the rule of international law, as we know it, as we, meaning we, established it, in the UN and other, international organizations, multilateral institutions, as they say, they imposed the rules of international order, but did you really have a hand in crafting them? No, you didn't. And so maybe it wouldn't be a bad idea to undermine it and overthrow it and replace it with one, let's say, written by people who, I guess now cast themselves as outsiders from that international regime. And you might be able to believe it when we're talking about, say, I don't know, Brazil or even India or, South Africa, possibly, but the rest of the BRICS. I mean, I don't know if you would believe, like Russia, China, they were kind of on the inside, and they sit on the Security Council as well. They have the vetoes. They were handed to them for no particular reason, also as successor states to the countries we were giving those vetoes to, although there was no really good reason to give it to nationalist China, perhaps. But anyway, we did, and here we are. So, that's not a bad idea. That'll probably take root in Africa and elsewhere. And on Africa in particular, the concept calls for a more equitable, polycentric world and elimination of social and economic inequality. That sounds good. Which is growing due to the sophisticated neo-colonial policies of some developed states toward Africa. That's probably us, or what they would like everyone to believe is us. And it doesn't leave Russia out, but of course, it's their document, so they'll leave Russia out if they want to. One wonders if lucrative weapons exports serve the concept's purpose of, quote, promoting and developing links in the humanitarian sphere, including scientific cooperation, training of national personnel, strengthening health systems, providing other assistance, promoting intercultural dialogue, protecting traditional spiritual and moral values, and the right to freedom of religion. All the things that you want to hear that your friends from abroad are going to support. But even if it really is just fluff covering weapons exports, one does wonder. For Mali alone, massacres in Mora, M-O-U-R-A, Mora, my best guess, hidden graves in Deobali, and killings in Mopti. Moy, these places are not daily reported on in the United States. Anyway, they divide rhetoric from reality. Russian objectives are pretty simple. Kill opponents to regimes in countries with military juntas or authoritarian leaders, and get gold in return from terrified heads of state all too willing to hand it over. Russia's, Wagner's until now, successes in confronting extremist groups like Jama'at Nasr al-Islam. Oh, wow, it's longer than that. Jama'at Nasr al-Islam wal Muslimin, or NJIM. That sounds easier to pronounce than that. Bolster their claims of assistance to beleaguered regimes and civil societies. This gives Russia a foot in the door. And I could see, I don't know anything about the group we're talking about here, although there's a link if you want to look it up from Wikipedia, just to give you an idea of exactly who we're talking about here, according to Wikipedia. That looks, well, there's a little flag here that makes it look exactly like ISIS, so maybe it's just African ISIS, essentially. Let's see. A militant jihadist organization in the Maghreb and West Africa formed by the merger of Ansar Dine, D-I-N-E, I don't know, and Masina Liberation Front, and many other organizations as well. So it looks like basically an ISIS for activity in Africa. So this is the sort of thing that, of course, would concern the United States, and we might look the other way, that the Russians, with whom we don't have any continuing cooperation at this point, are helping African nations stamp out their local ISIS cells. That's good, right? For the war on terrorism, that's a great way for the Russians to avoid our gaze, I suppose, as they assert military control in these regions, propping up military dictatorships. And, the United States has a long history of propping up military dictatorships in favor of, rather than allow, whether it was communist style separatists or rebels there, and now, of course, jihadist type. You can see why it would be initially, or why it would find favor among Western policymakers, even though the alternative that they propose a military dictatorship beholden to Russia was not a great idea. But is it less not great than allowing ISIS or ISIS-style jihadists to take over? As he says here, this gives Russia a foot in the door. Public pronouncements of admiration and support from Russia's friends in South Africa, Burkina Faso, recently Niger, and other regimes adds weight to the boots on their opposition's necks. He's a very flowery writer, this guy. Not all African voices follow or accept this logic. In his March 22nd, 2023, posting on Inkstick, about which I know nothing, Inkstick. Who's the writer we're talking about? Gonna have to struggle with the name here. Olatunji Olaigbe, I'm guessing, is the pronunciation. Perhaps. He's linked here so you can check him out for yourself. He tracks the cost of disinformation in Africa's largest democracy, Nigeria, in its March elections. While he does not directly trace these instances to Russian sources, the process comes clear enough to the perceptive eye. Africa watcher Mohammed Keita, Keita, of the Human Rights Foundation, sees clearly the Ukraine and Africa connection in Russia's connivances in his Champion of Solidarity, African Democracy Defenders Standing with Ukraine, an article from January of this year. Young Ukrainians clearly see their own high stakes in this one-sided onslaught. Maria Maximenko notes the connection in The Dangers of Russian Disinformation in Russia, Ukraine, and Africa. Julia Datsenko, Ilya Snigur, and Yulia, Rechuka, maybe, also describe the overlap in their November 2022 paper, Countering Russian Disinformation. I'm sure you've all read all the papers, though, right? So you know exactly who we're talking about. Okay. These are some obscure works for foreign policy wonks. Next up, Old Think and New Think. What's a democracy to do? During the Cold War, my colleagues and I in the Foreign Service believed that employing the tactics of the other, i.e. the Soviet Union, only makes us resemble them. We read this part into the record yesterday. This remains true, but transparent new measures become urgent, and of course there can and must be some. Between silence and resignation on the one hand, and the lies on the other, surely there's a vast reservoir of alternatives. When the great Todd Leventhal, everyone knows the great Todd Leventhal, right? Okay, I guess he's great, collected instances of Soviet active measures in the 1970s and 80s, the practice was to refute distortions through conventional media outlets. False assertions, like that AIDS was developed by the United States military to reduce the number of African Americans. Response: put out an op-ed, denounce through press releases, and demand retractions from KGB-funded outlets in Delhi, Scandinavia, and elsewhere. Another example, the false assertion, organ harvesting of poor Latin Americans is used for ruthless and rich North Americans in need. Response: broadcast an editorial over VOA, or set the record straight with items in the U.S. government's U.S. Information Agency wireless file in all world capitals. The loss of the file in recent years from budget cutbacks has removed a free source of news to needy and grateful radio and newspapers in the global south. Now, RT, and by the way, Xinhua, the Chinese news agency, stand ready to fill the gap. However, now in 2023, daily messages go out from the U.S. government, quote-unquote, correcting the record and providing, quote, answers to false Russian narratives, saying things with messages like, well, the truth of the matter is, da-da-da-da-da. But who listens to these missives? Some German that makes no sense to me. Okay, the various European outlets, German, French, etc., the Mail and the Guardian in the UK. Well, no, crickets. African civil society doesn't much come into contact with conventional sources, nor, for that matter, do young Americans and others get their news from gossip sources out online. What? No, they don't? In order for them to do, young Americans and others get their news from gossip sources. Yes, they do. But okay. This is horse and buggy stuff, he says. Your ill wisher has moved on to internal combustion. Do likewise or accept defeat. I guess another flourish that takes away, I think, from the actual messaging here. But okay, he loves throwing those things in. Western governments are understandably reluctant to get into that troll game. It would damage their credibility as transparent and principled news sources. VOA, for example, has strict journalistic codes instilled in its reporters, and rightfully so. VOA news and programming must be rigorously sourced and verified. That's, I guess, from their own sources. VOA is alert to and rejects efforts by special interest groups, foreign or domestic, to use its broadcasts as a platform for their own views. Well, good on VOA and other government information sources for maintaining these standards. However, this leaves a chasm in reaching civil societies and governments in the global south. Other government entities, including the U.S. Department of Defense, have developed low-footprint news sources, as they call them, over the decades, putting up websites that pass as independent. This practice has led to negative consequences and blowback. These used to be called gray psychological operations. Now, military information support operations, or MISO, if you want to call it that. An example, the website, Magharabia.com, which it says here, sick. So I guess something is spelled wrong here, but Magharebia.com. Launched by the Pentagon's European Command in 2004 to provide news about, not too surprising here, North Africa, paying locally employed journalists, maybe playing them as well, with Arabic names to publish positive articles about the United States. The site was not totally opaque, but was flat-footed enough to erode U.S. credibility in the Maghreb. Trust is built over decades and trashed in an instant. This lame effort at opacity was uncovered easily enough by CNN a year after it was created. Thanks, we did it to ourselves, huh? Congress took its time in dealing with the debacle, but in 2011 defunded and shut it down. Too late. Who in the Maghreb would ever listen to us again? Clandestine public diplomacy certainly sounds like an oxymoron and can do more harm than good. Moreover, it is likely to discredit its sources and ruin the careers of outsourced liberal writers shunned, killed even, by those who bear ill will toward the United States. Some terrorists are fools, but many are not. Greater transparency from the U.S. government sources is not much better. Observers equate U.S. messages with Russian ones in the equivalency game. Russia blankets us with disinformation. The United States responds with its own. It's all propaganda, and to hell with it. This is the entirely successful outcome of Vladimir Putin's rigorous methodology over the past 20 years. Who lifted a finger against it? How then to respond to trash coming from Russian trolls and Kremlin-backed media in Africa, which is already resulting in Russian advances up to and including the UN General Assembly? As one wily Soviet strategist once put it, what is to be done? You remember him, of course. Well, what is to be done? Plenty of hardworking U.S. government employees apply themselves to this issue. Enlightened NGOs like the German Marshall Fund also have outstanding programs highlighting, analyzing, charting, interpreting, and locating the sources of Russian disinformation in Africa and elsewhere. American reticence to enter the propaganda space is precious and should be preserved. Credibility depends on it. The Global Engagement Center at the Department of State does rigorous analysis, but correctly stops short of adding much to an already polluted information space, especially in Africa. Its strength is in outsourcing social media actions to private organizations. One U.S. government site, This Is a Warning, I guess that's the actual name of the site, was an inspired format for setting the record straight. It was dramatic, visceral, and utilized the elements of Aristotelian rhetoric. All praise to those who devised it. However, we have no way of knowing if the messages reached or convinced the African public. In addition, this is a warning, seems to have gone the way of the dodo due to budget cutbacks. Our government, our NGOs, can measure clicks but not opinions. Funding from Congress, like water, succumbs to gravity and seeks lower grounds. Again, a little too flowery for us. Guru Thomas Kent. Guru, really? Former director of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, reveals the process and imperative of finding effective responses. His 2020 book, Striking Back, is a must-read for anyone attempting to find solutions, or anyone enjoying this writing style, I guess. It presents the agony of choice, especially in its recommendations. Interdict, recognize strengths and weaknesses, create regional backshops or backstops. It says backshops. Block or not. Attack or soothe. Defund or degrade disinformation outlets. Segment the audience. Prepare for Kremlin efforts to block communications to its citizens. Utilize or minimize covert activities. Seek exposure. Kent made these points presciently 2 years before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. He recommended an array of choices for consideration by those trying to counter disinformation. However, good questions have no easy answers, and the dilemmas remain. By the way, even he, Mr. Foreign Policy Genius here, makes the mistake of dating the invasion of Ukraine to 2022 as opposed to 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. Not sure why that continues to happen. Next up, NGOs and private voluntary organizations. Governments have money, but an understandable inflexibility in clearance processes and in maintaining clean internal software. NGOs and independent citizen organizations have skills and limited money. What about putting the two elements together? Combining the relative strengths of each could produce results. Debunk EU, based in Lithuania, is such an NGO. It can speak freely, enters the information space without the limits and drawbacks of official imprimatur, and has a track record of conveying effective messaging to audiences now subject to Russian disinformation. Established to reach information-starved Russians in the Russian Federation, and knowing Russian advances in Africa will directly go against Baltic interests. That's a smart thought. It wouldn't occur to most people. It recently added Africa to its agenda. The U.S. and other governments should openly and transparently support it with modest financial resources to enlarge its audience. If governments can and should not get into the back and forth of lies versus truth in the public information space for good reasons, then outsource the effort and do so transparently. Debunk makes no secret of its methodology, which may be the most inventive to date, and it's linked here, the methodology. You can go and read it for yourself. Another is Open Minds Institute, OMI. OMI already partners with Harvard and the Ukrainian Ministry of Digital Transformation to find ways of penetrating closed media spaces in authoritarian states, especially Russia. Of course, Ukrainians know that Africa is crucial to them as well. Scrappy citizens organizations, more than governments, are now at the cutting edge of technology and messaging. All glory to U.S. government employees, but they work under constraints and protocols of internal clearance processes and IT systems hampered by government security mechanisms. He loves the all glory phrasing. And now the exciting, if a little bit weird, conclusion. In what is now an existential challenge to Africa by Russian disinformation, there's a delicate balance between fancy pants Robert's rules of order and playing hardball with an opponent who uses battle axes and sledgehammers. He's really getting to me with this. But it does, it's a good point underlying the overweening writing style. Anyway, we no longer have the luxury even to differentiate between challenges to Africa and the rest of us. And maybe that's the best point of all of it. Probably the best attempt at reconciling these two extremes comes from Tom Kent. In the global meme wars, it's time to side with the elves against the trolls. Oh boy, they're all like this. Just say what you mean, guys. We must recognize not only that the horse is out of the barn, but that the barn never had much of a door to begin with. The game may seem nearly over, but it's not yet lost if we grab hold of ourselves. As with global warming, you might say we botched our chances, missed the deadline, but a late start is imperative, and better by far than none. Plus, other than resignation and guaranteed defeat, there is no other option. In the words of one inspired colleague, first do no harm, but do something. How do you like that? Okay, well, we've gotten to the end of this, and I think it had some important insights that just we had to kind of wade through the, the self-congratulatory, overweening writing style here. It could have benefited from an awful lot of editing, but important points were gotten across here. Okay, and now we can turn our attention closer to home, I think, and catch up with a number of other stories. Let's see. Boy, first on the list, probably where you probably thought we were going, was to the latest on Clarence Thomas and his ethical shortcomings. He's put out a new revised statement on his, a new personal disclosure statement, seeking to, catch up, I guess, with the various things that he's been caught out doing, and accepting all sorts of gifts from his just happen to be billionaire good friends. And I guess he thinks this now is a step towards making him square with the American public so that people will stop calling for his resignation / impeachment. But it doesn't do much to clear things up, and doesn't do much to actually make him look like he's on the up and up. Let's see. We'll start here with this report from a couple days ago from The Hill. Zach Schoenfeld reporting, this is just yesterday. Clarence Thomas discloses multiple trips accepted from GOP megadonor Harlan Crow. This is just the basic recitation of things, then some analysis after that. Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas has, of course, now disclosed 3 more trips that he accepted from billionaire Harlan Crow last year. According to documents made public Thursday, Thomas has denied any wrongdoing in accepting the trips, 2 of which were to Dallas. It sounds like a punishment more than anything else. And 1 to the Adirondacks in New York, a famous judicial hotspot where you got to go fairly frequently if you're a Supreme Court justice, I guess. For one of the trips, Thomas said he flew private because of security concerns. But what security concerns? Specifically, security concerns following the leak of the draft abortion opinion. So a security concern of their own making, probably. His new financial disclosure form also includes supplemental information about a 2014 real estate transaction with Crow, which Thomas's attorney said Thursday was inadvertently omitted from past reports. That would be the sale of his mother's home to Harlan Crow, major commercial business real estate developer who just, suddenly took an interest in residential real estate in Savannah, so long as it's owned by, Clarence Thomas, anyway, or his family members. In 2014, of course, Crow bought 3 properties from Thomas and his family in Savannah, Georgia, transactions that raised the ire of congressional Democrats when they were first publicized in news reports by ProPublica this year. ProPublica also reported on trips that Crow paid for Thomas in its stories. Thomas previously said he was advised the trips he accepted from Crow fell under a personal hospitality exception and did not need to be reported. That's wrong, of course. In the new disclosure, Thomas indicated the 2 Dallas trips were for him to be the keynote speaker at conferences held by the American Enterprise Institute. So how is that Harlan Crow's personal hospitality? Well, the justice says he was reimbursed to fly private back from Dallas in February of 2022 due to an unexpected ice storm. That's a good reason for private aviation. Thomas said he flew private to and from the second conference in May due to security concerns. Because of the increased security risk followed by the Dobbs opinion leak, which they were probably responsible for, the May flights were by private plane for official travel, as Flyers security detail recommended non-commercial travel wherever possible. Thomas's disclosure states, the extraordinary leak of the draft opinion that overturned Roe v. Wade rattled the court. Fences were installed around the Supreme Court building, and one man was arrested for attempted murder of fellow conservative Justice Brett Kavanaugh. Everyone remembers that attempt? Yes, it was probably out there. Thomas's newly disclosed New York trip appears to be to Crow's private lakeside resort, a location ProPublica reported Thomas has traveled to on multiple past occasions. Thomas listed Keys Mill, New York, as the location of the trip, which is, of course, the town where the resort is located. The disclosures follow a March clarification from the federal judiciary's policymaking arm about the personal hospitality exception to disclosing gifts. Under the new rules, the exception does not apply to trips and stays at commercial properties. Flights to and from Adirondacks by private plane and lodging, food and entertainment at the Adirondacks property were reportable under and in compliance with the new guidance. Thomas's disclosure states. On Thursday, a lawyer for Thomas defended his activities and disclosures. Justice Thomas's critics allege that he failed to report gifts from wealthy friends. Untrue! Elliot Burke, an attorney who helped prepare the disclosure, said in a statement, except that he hadn't disclosed them. He has never accepted a gift from anyone with business before the court. For anyone who knows him at all, it is clear that no one influences Justice Clarence Thomas's jurisprudence. But friends are dear, close, and separate, Burke continued. Thomas's disclosure also includes multiple amendments, wink wink, about his finances in previous years, which Burke insisted were all mistakes and not intentional wrongdoing. Yeah, he's disclosed everything except for all the things he didn't disclose, and those things were mistakes. Yeah, we know they were mistakes. We caught you making them. Anyway, the form discloses personal bank accounts and life insurance held by Thomas's wife, conservative activist Ginny Thomas, of course, and corrects the misnaming of her family's real estate holding. Lots of mistakes they're making over there. Thomas's form also notably discloses for the first time Crow's purchase of 3 Savannah, Georgia properties, earlier discussed. Thomas's mother lived in one of those properties and reportedly continued to do so after Crow's purchase. The justice said the deal amounted to a capital loss for him. Boo-hoo, huh? And he has since had to spend between $50,000 and $75,000 on improvements. Wow, too bad. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Roots Radio. We got to slog on through the reported facts here because they just get weirder and weirder as his lawyer does his legal speak dance to try to get out from underneath the accusations. So as we were saying here, the Justice Thomas said that the deal, the sale of the Savannah properties, amounted to a capital loss for him, as he had spent between $50,000 and $75,000 on improvements to his mother's home. There's the idea. Okay. You see, so this is why he thought he didn't have to report selling his mom's house to Harlan Crow, major real estate billionaire, but good friend. And, the normal kind of transaction. Harlan Crow buys the property and then not only does nothing with it, but lets somebody else occupy it for free. You know, the way you make billions of dollars. That's how it's done, right? So this is why he thought, Thomas argues he never had to disclose this, was he had at one point spent somewhere between $50,000 and $75,000 on improvements to his mom's home, but when he sold it, he only received $44,000 in proceeds from the sale. So you see, one time back in 1990, I spent $75,000 improving the place. And then in 2014, I sold it and I only got $44,000 out of the transaction. So since I had spent money 10 years earlier and I got less now, that's a capital loss. So it's not a contribution to me. I don't need to tell you about it. I had a big hole in my pocket plugged by cash stuffed there by Harlan Crow, but I don't have to tell you about it because if you compare the money I spent 10 years ago, maybe if I spent it and if I declared it correctly, and then compared to what was just stuffed in my pocket, it's less that was stuffed in my pocket than I say I spent 10 years earlier to give my mom a house to live in. So therefore I don't have to tell you anything about it. That's pretty damn weak. Here from the updated filing, it says, filer, that is, of course, Thomas, had previously reported his interest in 2 of the Savannah properties, excluding his mother's residence, in the years when they generated rental income. Once these properties no longer generated any rental income, right? He owned 3 properties there. Mom lives in 1. The other 2 are rental properties. When he made money from the rental properties, apparently, he says he reported it. But then when he started losing money on the rental properties, he decided he didn't have to tell anyone he owned it anymore. So that also means I don't have to tell you about any of the losses I'm incurring. So there you go. Now I don't have to tell you about anything. Once these properties no longer generated any rental income, filer was advised by committee staff, he says, to remove the 2 properties from his disclosure forms. Thomas's disclosure states, but do you own them? Yes. Do they have value? Yes. Do they belong on your disclosure? Yes, they do. But they're not making any money. So what? For clarity's sake, if nothing else, I mean, the properties didn't disappear, right? You didn't sell them, right? They didn't burn to the ground, right? Okay. If someone were to come along, let's say a friendly billionaire, and offer you $1 million for the properties, how would you explain that you got the $1 million? You would have to tell people that you sold the properties, but you stopped telling anybody you owned the properties. Why would you do something like that? It makes no sense. Continues on here. However, filer inadvertently failed to realize, that's a hell of a phrase, that the sales transaction for the final disposition of the 3 properties triggered a new reportable transaction in 2014, even though this sale resulted in a capital loss, it continued. I mean, that is the weakest sauce I ever heard in my life. Did you just sell these properties? Yes. For how much? $10. Do you have to disclose the $10? Yeah, you do. But I bought the property for $100, so that's a capital loss. Doesn't matter, dummy. I mean, you don't want people to know that you're a terrible businessman? Is that what the problem is? You sold property. Put it on the form. Did you sell any property this year? Yes. Well, I didn't really sell it because it was sold for a loss. No, that's called selling, but for a loss. You know, whatever your problems are, I don't care. The point is, you sold those properties. Put it down on paper. Both Thomas and fellow conservative Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito, it goes on to say, had both received extensions on their 2022 disclosures, and their forms were made public Thursday. The other justices' forms were released earlier this summer. Alito came under controversy after ProPublica reports detailed how Alito in 2008 was flown to Alaska on a private jet by hedge fund billionaire Paul Singer for a fishing trip. Years later, Alito participated in several cases in which a subsidiary of Singer's hedge fund was a party. Alito has also denied any wrongdoing and insists that he was not obligated to recuse himself. His new disclosure details reimbursements he received for 2 trips last year, both of which were paid for by law schools and were previously known. Notre Dame Law School paid for Alito's transportation, lodging, and meals to Rome last summer for a religious liberty summit. By the way, speaking of religious liberty, more on that judge that is forcing Southwest Airlines attorneys to take religious liberty training from the Alliance Defending Freedom. See if we can get to that one. And Duke Law School paid for Alito's lodging and meals in North Carolina as he taught a class there, according to the disclosure. The recent ProPublica stories have triggered an effort by Democrats in the Senate to institute tougher ethics standards on the Supreme Court. You know about where we stand in all of that. I think we can jump out of this article at this point. It's going nowhere because Republicans object to it because it's just fundamentally bad for them. Now, I said there was some analysis of the situation. For that, I turn to the very fun team of Dahlia Lithwick and Mark Joseph Stern, who write together all the time in, where are we? Slate magazine. The most galling part of Clarence Thomas's latest ethics disclosure. Let's see if it's the part that galled me. When Justice Samuel Alito, it begins, responded earlier this year to reporting on his 2008 decision to accept and not disclose a seat on a private jet owned by a billionaire with business before the Supreme Court, his defense was that the seat he occupied would have otherwise been vacant. By the way, as I dive into this, I gotta say, having been through the law and economics curriculum training at the George Mason School of Law, where they continue to try to train judges and other members of the judiciary, both federal and state. Well, judges are the members of the judiciary, not other members of the judiciary. But anyway, they train them in the law and economics theory. I recognize it at work in these claims. Like, why didn't you disclose these gifts that you got or these sales that you made? And the answer is, well, they were economic losses. So on net, it was like I paid them, except it doesn't work that way. The party that bought the properties from you isn't the party that, was responsible for your loss or something like that. There was, the IRS code is much clearer on these things. All income from whatever source derived is what's of interest to the IRS. And the fact that there are losses that can offset your tax liability, but it doesn't mean you don't have to report them. And in fact, it very much does mean you have to report them in order to justify the deductions that you're taking. You have to show the mathematical loss, regardless of what the origins of it were. But this is law and economics thinking here. Distorted, but it's law and economics thinking. Well, if on net there was no gain, then there's no gift. And so therefore, I don't have to tell anybody about it. But the money, the $44,000 that Clarence Thomas says he pocketed from the sales, even though it was offset by previous losses, the source of the $44,000 is not the same as the source of the loss, right? I lost $75,000 fixing up my mom's house. So, right. So there's a $75,000 loss, let's say. $44,000 later gets stuffed in your pocket. Are you happy about that or are you unhappy about it? Well, it was a net loss. So boo-hoo, I'm unhappy, right? I'm still out, let's say, $31,000 at the high end of $75,000 he says he laid out. He also says it was between 50 and 75. So maybe it was only a $6,000 loss 10 years ago. And the loss is painting and repairing his mom's house or furnishing it. I don't know exactly what he was doing. Putting a new roof on it. I have no idea. Doesn't matter. The point is, if you laid out $50,000 10 years ago, are you happy that there's now $44,000 in cash in your pocket? Sure, you are. Is the fact that it doesn't equal the $50,000 you spent, does that mean I don't have to tell anybody who put this $44,000 in my pocket because I'm unhappy that I still lost $6,000? No, not at all. But that's the excuse, an economic excuse. It's economic reasoning. There's still a loss here, you see, so I don't have to report it because it's not a net gain, therefore can't be a gift. No, the $44,000, that guy has no reason to be putting $44,000 in your pocket, and it's made you happy. Who was the person that made you happy? Why did they do it? And what did they want for it? That's the point of the disclosure. All right, I'll let Dahlia and Mark tell the story. All right, so Alito's story is first up. I don't have to tell you about this trip because if I hadn't gone on the seat, it would otherwise have been vacant on this private plane. And so it's really, what was the gift to me? Nothing, right? They don't make any money and I don't make any money. There was just this empty seat that would have had no economic value. And therefore I took it and it doesn't do anything to the economy. It's a macroeconomic excuse for not reporting a microeconomic transaction. It doesn't make any sense. All right. So at the time, it seemed like the Marie Antoinette-iest legal reasoning ever advanced for taking a costly gift. On Thursday, however, his colleague Clarence Thomas went one better. In filing his delayed 2022 financial disclosure forms, the justice, who had failed to disclose dozens of private flights, luxury vacations, loans, gifts, and several real estate deals for the bulk of his time on the court, belatedly reported 3 2022 trips on the private jet of his friend Harlan Crow. The reason for at least one spontaneous outbreak of private jet travel? Because of increased security risk following the Dobbs opinion leak, the disclosure notes. The May flights were by private plane for official travel as flyer security detail recommended non-commercial travel wherever possible. You see, it's not him, it's you. You're making the justices fly on private flights. Look what you made him do. I agree. That is actually quite galling, isn't it? Especially when you realize that it was probably the conservatives who leaked that information after all. And if it turned out to be Ginny Thomas, could it get any more galling than that? To cement the conclusion, they continue, that Thomas is the real victim of the reporting around his years of non-disclosures and elisions. How do you pronounce that? Eliding things. Or, as they are now called, inadvertent omissions. Thomas's attorney, Elliot S. Burke, attached a statement to the disclosure decrying the reporting as a partisan feeding frenzy against the justice, as opposed to rightly pointing out his shortcomings. The disclosures and subsequent calls for accountability from, quote, left-wing groups, or people who like transparency, Burke declared amounted to a political blood sport motivated by hatred for his judicial philosophy, not by any real belief in ethical lapses. The same justices who unfailingly see themselves as the only victims in America can't stop using their own personal safety as a get-out-of-ethics free card. And that card, it would seem, confers powers that move backward through time and space to justify all past and future violations as well. Maybe that's why they'll eventually be sympathetic to Madison Cawthorn's sort of theory that the amnesty, post-Civil War amnesty, is also prospective, and all future insurrectionists will be pardoned by it as well. Anyway, at the center of all of this, they continue, are, of course, Thomas's billionaire benefactors, or as Burke describes them, personal friends who happen to be wealthy. You see, the fact that so many of Thomas's besties happen to be billionaires is incidental. As Burke puts it, for anyone who knows him at all, it is clear that no one influences Justice Thomas's jurisprudence. Not even his own brain, apparently. But friends are dear, close, and separate. This is Crow's story as well. Never mind that Harlan's wife, Kathy Crow, sits on the board of trustees for the Manhattan Institute, which regularly files amicus briefs before the SCOTUS. Surely that's not real business before the court. Or perhaps Kathy doesn't count as the gift giver, as the friendly offerings extended were Harlan's alone. Or maybe the mysterious Dobbs leaker did further time traveling to force Kathy's hand in taking a prominent position on a conservative group that churns out business before the court. One thing is clear. Scanning the eye-popping number of corrections, updates, and amendments to Thomas's filing induces a simultaneous sense of wonder and despair. Wonder at the sheer quantity of oopsies covering millions of dollars worth of insurance policies, bank accounts, assets, luxury travel, and ultra-high-end transportation that the justice mysteriously forgot to include in past disclosures. And despair at the entitled and indignant tone of both the disclosure itself and the unhinged letter accompanying it. Burke alleges that the new report utterly refutes all criticism of Thomas's ethics when it actually validates them. If the justice had been following the law this whole time, there would be no need for pages and pages of major corrections. And he could not possibly have been caught off guard. It was just last decade that Thomas corrected his failure to report $680,000 worth of income earned by his wife Ginny. After more than 3 decades on the court, the justice, one might expect, would have grasped the ground rules of federal ethics law. Yet, in his lawyer's telling, his extreme noncompliance was as an innocent, minor, blameless mistake in a humdrum disclosure process that's been weaponized against Thomas. The excuse at the heart of Thomas's defense is that the disclosure law exempts personal hospitality, which until this year the Judicial Conference's guidance defined broadly enough to encompass private flights and paid-for stays at private resorts. But we must stress, again, that the underlying federal statute exempts only food, lodging, or entertainment provided by an individual, and that at least some of Thomas's secret gifts do not fall under the most sweeping definition of these terms. A Supreme Court justice surely has the reading comprehension to grasp this fact. And so, Given the sneering and self-righteous tone of Burke's letter, its subtext seems to be, at some point long ago, some justices and their pals sat down in a circle, maybe in some Adirondack chairs under a totem pole, and simply decided amongst themselves that the rules as written didn't apply to travel, gifts, and deals that would benefit them. Of course, the Adirondack chairs under a totem pole, referring to, I guess, the scene, wasn't it captured in oil painting of Thomas and his pals and Crow and others sitting around probably at the Adirondack resort, in the Adirondack chairs, no less, enjoying cigars out on the deck. That's the scene they're setting here. Anyway, this sniffing that a couple of innocent filing errors are just an occupational hazard may be necessary to ward off the more obvious and sensible conclusion to be drawn here, which is that Thomas applies one standard to himself and another to everyone else, and most specifically to capital defendants who face execution because of errors committed by their attorneys through no fault of their own and often without their knowledge. Right? You make a mistake in your legal filing, sorry, we have to execute you nonetheless. Make an error in your ethical filings, well, everybody knows that, nobody's perfect. That's a good point. Hadn't thought about that one much. In perhaps the most egregious example of his rulings to that effect on the court, in 2012's Maples versus Thomas, two lawyers at the law firm Sullivan and Cromwell volunteered to represent Corey Maples, an indigent defendant contesting his death sentence. The lawyers left the law firm and ended their representation, but failed to inform their client. That ain't great. An Alabama court ruled against Maples automatically because his erstwhile lawyers had failed to appear. Maples had no idea. He then inadvertently forfeited the actual opposite of that. He forfeited his right to an appeal because the clock ran out with no filings from his lawyers. Again, without his knowledge. Like, he's in prison. He can't monitor this stuff all that easily. The Alabama court sent copies of its decision to Sullivan and Cromwell, but the mailroom returned them unopened. When Maples finally discovered these mistakes, he asked the federal court for relief, pointing to his lawyers' blunders. A lower court ruled against him, but the Supreme Court sided with Maples, declaring a client cannot be charged with the acts or omissions of an attorney who has abandoned him. Thank God they did that, but of course Thomas dissented there. He, along with, surprisingly enough, Scalia, would have left the consequences of Sullivan and Cromwell's error fall upon Maples, with the resulting death penalty. As a consequence, Scalia and Thomas reasoned that Maples had no right to counsel to begin with, because he had already been convicted. So, they concluded, his counsel's mistakes did not provide cause for a do-over. What was this idea that once you've been convicted, you have no right to an attorney, huh? I think that's novel. This pattern continues throughout each case involving a lawyer who messes up when seeking post-conviction relief for their client. And to be sure, most of the oopsies are far less shocking than the conduct diminished by Thomas's enraged attorney. Diminished? Okay. I don't think that's the word I would have used. In 2010's Holland versus Florida, the defendant, Albert Holland, urged his lawyer to file a petition on time based on his own correct understanding of the law. Yet that lawyer missed the deadline based on his own incorrect understanding of the law. The Supreme Court ruled for Holland, suspending the deadline because of the attorney's mistake. Once again, Thomas dissented. Similarly, in 2015's Christensen versus Roper, attorneys for the capital defendant Mark Christensen didn't even meet with him until 6 weeks after the filing deadline had passed. They finally submitted their petition 117 days late. Not great. Those same lawyers then refused to seek a deadline extension based on their own malfeasance. So Christensen sought different, more competent lawyers who did not have a conflict of interest. The lower courts ruled against him once again and greenlit his execution, but the Supreme Court halted his killing with mere hours to spare. Thomas again dissented. Later, the court granted his request for new attorneys. Thomas dissented again. Unfortunately, Thomas has not always been on the losing side of those cases. In fact, he wrote the majority opinion in Lawrence versus Florida, a particularly egregious 5-4 decision in 2007. The facts were depressingly familiar. A lawyer for Gary Lawrence, who contested his death sentence, missed a deadline that prevented him from seeking relief. Lawrence asked for an extension, equitable tolling, citing his attorney's error. Thomas refused. Writing for the court, he explained, if credited, this argument would essentially equitably toll limitations periods for every person whose attorney missed the deadline. Oh boy, that would be horrible, right? Attorney miscalculation is simply not sufficient to warrant equitable tolling, particularly in the post-conviction context where prisoners have no constitutional right to counsel. I don't know that everybody agrees that that's the case, but I guess that's the state of the law with this Supreme Court. I don't do any I don't do any practice at all, much less criminal appellate practice. So maybe that's not a surprise to people who do. Marvel at this irony. They bring it all back to the ethical lapses here. Clarence Thomas had the assistance of every lawyer he could ever want in drafting his financial disclosures. Indeed, he subtly threw some of them under the bus in his Thursday amendments, suggesting that any genuine errors can be pinned back on bad advice received from the Judicial Conference of the United States, or states if you prefer, which advises and adjudicates judicial ethics compliance, and which revised its reporting requirements earlier this year in the wake of the Thomas revelations. The justice has, as is increasingly evident, ample resources to pay his lawyers, unlike the indigent defendants who are often given minimal or substandard representation by attorneys with hundreds of other cases to juggle. He also has ample time in which to comply with the standard disclosure process followed by thousands of other public officials, unlike capital defendants who face onerous deadlines with little or no information on how to meet them. And when they do get little or no information, still figure it out better than their lawyers do, apparently. At the bare minimum, Thomas's new filing proves that even the most powerful jurists and attorneys make errors, grievous ones, all the time. Instead of stating that with humility and offering the same grace to others, the justice has taken the opportunity to remind us, time and again, I would say, that when his errors are pointed out, it's weaponization of the legal system by malign haters. For Thomas, equal justice under the law means that to err is human when the powerful do it, and that deciding which errors are trivial and thus forgivable is what makes him nothing short of divine. And a little flight of fancy at the end there, but we get the point. Good point and good opportunity to point out his horrible record on those sorts of death penalty appeals and how hypocritical it really is. So another level of analysis added to the mix here. Okay, I've got to catch up on a couple of other things here. This one will wait perhaps until after the break, but maybe we can sneak this one in. I hinted to you that there was more on the Southwest Airlines stuff. Chris Geidner, in his Law Dork newsletter, points out there's news here. Judge doubles down on Southwest, quote-unquote, religious liberty training sanctions order. And it is, of course, Judge Starr, and yes, he's a relative. Judge Starr refused to put the sanctions on hold while the airline appeals and called questions about requiring the training from a far-right group a gripe, he says in his subheader. He begins by displaying the front page style of the case here. Charlene Carter versus the Transport Workers Union of America, Local 556, and Southwest Airlines, the name of the case, in the United States District Court for the Northern District of Texas in the Dallas Division. And he reports U.S. District Judge Brantley Starr, yes, Ken Starr's relative, stood by his religious liberty training sanctions in a late-night filing on Thursday night, last night, denying Southwest Airlines a stay of the sanctions order while they appealed it. The 23-page opinion and order is just the latest step in the twisting case where the Texas judge earlier this summer held Southwest Airlines in contempt for their response to a post-trial order from 2022 in a religious discrimination case brought by a flight attendant years before that. As part of the contempt order, Starr required, quote, religious liberty training for 3 of the airline's lawyers. Those lawyers, he had determined, were most responsible for a post-trial notice sent to flight attendants, although the airline had been ordered to tell the flight attendants that it, quote, may not discriminate against flight attendants on the basis of their religious practices and beliefs. It instead sent out a notice that it, quote, does not discriminate. A little haughty, I guess. Along with the judgment and jury verdict in the case, and a memorandum about civility. This, from Starr's vantage point, unsurprisingly, it says here, led to sanctions, as he wrote in Thursday's ruling. Southwest is appealing the sanctions order and asked Starr to put the sanctions on hold pending that appeal. Nope, we're a little bit late on our music here, so that'll be an awkward exit, but we can make it work. Southwest is appealing the sanctions order, right? Asked for things to be put on hold pending that appeal. Starr had issued a 30-day administrative stay on August 17th to allow him and any appeals court time to consider Southwest's request. In Thursday's ruling, he noted, well, we'll tell you exactly what he did because we got to exit. We'll be right back. Hi everybody, it's me, David Waldman. Yes, the same guy who interrupts you all the time. Interrupting you one more time just to tell you again, another reminder that your contributions are what keep this show on the air, and patreon.com, patreon.com, is still among the easiest ways to make the sustaining subscription donations that keep us afloat. Are you ready for the pep talk about how our Patreon campaign is still going strong and growing? Well, too bad. Yeah, the plain fact is we actually are headed in the wrong direction, and whereas we once had about 175 monthly patrons, we're now actually down below 150. Time to recruit some more. Not exactly the kind of news I wanted to share, but there it is. For those of you in a position to support the show, patreon.com does make it easy to make those secure, recurring monthly contributions to do so. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. We've been through a lot together. The worst of the pandemic, we hope. The worst of the insurrection, we hope. So go ahead and treat yourself. You don't need an excuse. Give yourself the gift of a little something you enjoy in life. Support the show. And of course, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running on those options too. So thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We couldn't, or at least shouldn't, do it without you. Hope you'll be on board soon too. Thanks for all your support. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. A late re-entry, but it makes the editing easier later on. All right, where were we in the middle of this? Right, Chris Geidner's report on the latest in the Southwest Airlines case. As we left off, let's see, where did we leave off? Judge Starr, yes, had issued a 30-day administrative stay back on August 17th, allowing him and any appeals court time to consider Southwest's stay request. On Thursday, he noted that the 30-day administrative hold, remains in effect. Friday, today, is day 15, which will allow the airline time to seek a stay from the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, even though chances might not be great there. In their argument for the stay to Starr, the airline argued both that contempt wasn't appropriate here at all, and that the order violates the airline's First Amendment rights. Additionally, they argued that the judge only exacerbated the problem by ordering that the religious liberty training come from the Alliance Defending Freedom, an extremist ideological legal advocacy organization, one that really doesn't have any grounding in religious liberty training per se, and two, is also a frequent party before the court, which makes for an awkward situation as well. Thursday night, Starr, a Trump appointee who is former senior lawyer in the Texas Attorney General's office, the nephew of Ken Starr, I missed a word or two in there, but you get the idea. He's the nephew of Ken Starr, formerly with the Texas Attorney General's office. Texas Attorney General currently, of course, facing impeachment proceedings there by the Republican legislature. Anyway, he also is a Federalist Society member, which these days means you could get yourself indicted for the January 6th riot. Didn't only deny their stay of request, he reinforced his initial religious liberty training order and kept going. The court hopes that once Southwest is armed with a better understanding of religious liberty, Starr says, no further court intervention will be necessary. Well, we'll see about that. Starr doubled and tripled down on his arguments made in the sanctions order, stating on Thursday that the instant briefing on the stay request shows that religious liberty training is more necessary now than ever before. He went on to insist that Southwest still hasn't acknowledged that the civility memo's mandated adherence to Southwest's policies undermined the court-ordered notice. In sum, he wrote, Southwest lawyers misunderstanding the relationship between their policies and Title VII. They have dire need for, but he says they direly need religious liberty training. I don't think so. As to the choice of ADF specifically to do the training, Starr in no way explained why or how he selected them. They had not in any way been a part of the case, and the plaintiff in the case had not even sought religious liberty training in her contempt motion, but did instead mock the airline for even raising the issue, calling it a gripe. Southwest is almost certain to appeal, of course. Here's the gripe reference. Well, it doesn't really matter. It appears in a screen grab there. You get the idea that it was important that he would characterize it that way. Yeah, I mean, essentially, the big mistake here was they lost the case, and they were supposed to, post-trial, issue a memo to their staff saying, remember, the outcome of the case is we lost, and that means we may not engage in any kind of religious discrimination with our employees. And it was perhaps foolish wordsmithing. They didn't want to admit they had lost the case and were being forced to do it. And so I'm sure it was aspirational more than anything else, to borrow a phrase from another person who thinks they should be let off the hook. Aspirational to say that, well, Southwest doesn't engage in religious liberty discriminations, so don't worry about it. We're not going to be doing that anytime soon. And, maybe the reason is because we lost in court. But yeah, they should have been more honest about what was going on and told everybody the court says we may not engage in any religious discrimination. It was never our intention to do so. And so it's, not going to be, we hope, a major change in our policy. The court says we may not discriminate, and it has always been our goal not to discriminate. So we're working together hand in glove on that. And that might have been an okay way of saying it. But saying that it does not engage in religious discrimination could be viewed, as it was here, by the judge as a backhanded way of saying, well, the court was wrong. They said we may not engage in it, but we don't. So therefore, everything is okay. Well, okay, that would piss off the judge. Whether or not that is going to be fixed by religious sensitivity training, that was more, maybe, I don't know, the training you need is how to be not a sore loser when you get your ass handed to you in court, even if it was wrong to hand you your ass. Anyway, I just thought it was an important update because a lot of people were outraged by that situation. And now you know what's happening there. All right, let's see. Completely different subject, but I would say this now being brought to the fore by popular demand, as I think now 3 different people have sent me this story, and it's a gun fail story. So I guess there's, they're rightfully wondering how this has escaped our notice. But, the focus has been elsewhere lately. That's all I can say about that. And let me see, which version of the story can I read you? I don't know. There's about 3 or 4 of them that have been shared with me along the way. Patrick Snyder sent me a version of this story via email on August 28th. Let's see. Last night, Scott sent me a link to this story. Are they all from the same source? No. There are several. And who else sent me the other story? I think, is it in Twitter? Yeah, I think so. Let's see if I can scroll back a little ways and find it, because it wasn't someone who was usually chiming in with these things. But yeah, here we are. Charles Evans, who sent this one along yesterday as well, this time with a HuffPost story being circulated on the Bird app by the No Lie with Brian Tyler Cohen account. And In each case, very egregious. So let's see. I'll open up the HuffPost version of it here. And let me see where Scott referred us to here. If I can do that relatively quickly. There's Scott here. Gotta go back a little ways here. Okay, yeah, this is also... this one is from People magazine. And let's see, the original one that I got via email came from, what am I looking at here? smartnews.com. Okay. So, I don't know. I guess there's different angles to be had from all of them. Let me start with the one that happens to be open first, Smart News, because this one gives us a picture of the perpetrator rather than pictures of the victim. The victim makes for a good picture because it tugs at the heartstrings. So, which direction to go? Maybe the HuffPost version will give us what we're looking for here. Their headline on this one from Drusilla Morehouse: 4-year-old fatally shot by woman, terrible, right, who was teaching her firearm safety. Authorities say this is a very interesting and confusing story on a number of levels. But I mean, right there is the headline is the lead story there for sure. 4-year-old fatally shot by a woman who was teaching her firearm safety. Well, okay. 1, good job teaching her firearm safety. 2, what were you teaching a 4-year-old firearm safety for anyway? Well, sure. There are some gun nut parents, of course, who insist that it's okay for them to keep loaded weapons around the house because they've taught their kids firearm safety from an early age. Now, it doesn't work very well. And, the record is replete with kids who were supposedly taught firearm safety from toddler age, who nonetheless found the guns and shot themselves. So I guess the lesson didn't take, and maybe it's not a great idea to say everything will be okay if I just teach a toddler mind about handheld instant death machines before they have any concept of death or whatever, lots of reasons why that would fail in the first instance. But here it has failed again. But here, now we get to the second level. Okay, well, how are you teaching firearm safety with a loaded weapon exactly, and you end up fatally... Well, a mistake was made. Of course, one of the whole, the real thrust behind firearm safety training for adults is, well, a mistake is possibly fatal in these cases. And so when we teach firearm safety, we teach it in a way that's got multiple redundancies built in. The idea of which is to avoid fatal shooting, at the very least, when handling guns in any way. And the most embarrassing way, of course, teaching firearm safety. But then we'll start with the HuffPost story because it's the one I know that raises these other weird questions. They're forced to report the story in a way that is vague and unsatisfying in some aspects, minor aspects, but important aspects nonetheless. Because of the basic weirdness of American society, or the basic weirdnesses that arise under American society, because there are so many people in so many varied situations. We can't claim to know what it is that leads to this, but you might ask, okay, 4-year-old fatally shot by woman. Now that sounds technically true. And very often we read headlines like that, and then you go on to read, well, the woman was teaching the toddler firearm safety. Well, who might be doing that? Well, usually the parent looking for, I don't know, some sort of excuse for keeping the loaded weapons around. But it doesn't say fatally shot by mother. But so surely, I don't know, sister, aunt? What's the story here? And now you get an idea of what the weirdness might be as it comes up here. Okay, so the subheader gives us this information. Brianna Gail Deval Runyons, I guess that's her full name, she's been booked now, 25, was charged with first-degree murder and aggravated child abuse in the death of Evangeline Gunter in Tennessee. And where else could something like this happen? Well, the answer is anywhere in the United States, because there's guns all over the place. Well, here's the story. A 4-year-old in Tennessee died after being shot point blank in the chest Sunday by a woman who said she was teaching the girl firearms safety, according to authorities. A woman? Who is this woman? Brianna Gail Duvall Runyons, that doesn't really answer the question, was charged with first-degree murder and aggravated child abuse in the death of Evangeline Gunter. The child's parents, yes, where were the parents? Adam and Josie Gunter, right? It's not necessarily the case that because they have separate, different surnames, they're not mother and child, right? But now it's cleared up. Adam and Josie Gunter are the parents. Well, they told ABC affiliate WATE that Evangeline had been in temporary custody at a home in Rockwood, which Runyons shared with girlfriend Christina Daniels and another child, a 7-year-old girl. Okay, that's a matter of fact. But what? And, is it a babysitter? Is it a court-ordered thing? Temporary custody. That would be an adequate factual, not adequate, a true factual recitation of what had happened in a babysitting situation. You're in temporary custody. But that's not the sort of language people normally use. Something else is going on here. According to a Tennessee Bureau of Investigation arrest warrant obtained by HuffPost, Runyons told police that she had taken a 9mm handgun out of its case, removed the magazine. Oh my gosh. Now we see what's going on. Removed the magazine and called Evangeline over to, quote, show her firearm safety. I don't know. Why does someone in temporary custody of this girl feel the need to teach firearm safety at all? Well, it sounds like these are gun nut people and they know that they've got young kids in the house. And so they're going to do the quote unquote responsible thing and quote unquote teach quote unquote firearm safety. Well, I guess we'll just state at the outset, there's no plausible scenario of firearms safety teaching which, if done properly, brings you into a situation where anybody can be shot point blank in the chest. Why? Because firearm safety, whether you're teaching it or practicing it or both, teaches us we always treat every gun as loaded, even if you have just taken out the magazine, because everybody, semi-automatic weapons, emptying the magazine doesn't mean the gun isn't loaded. Where could there already be another round? In the chamber. Does removing the magazine remove the bullet in the chamber? It does not. Oh, I'm sorry. I said bullet rather than round. This is all invalid. I don't know what I'm talking about. You can't. No. You've got to fully render that weapon fully safe. And that means not just pulling the magazine, but racking the slide so that you can eject any round that might have been forgotten about or previously chambered, right? You got to have that out of there. The fact that you've taken out the magazine doesn't mean the gun isn't loaded. But genius safety instructor here not only forgot that rule for some reason, but also forgot the other rule, which is that we don't point our guns at anything that we're not willing to kill or destroy, right? Always point the gun in a safe direction. Is the chest of a 4-year-old in your temporary custody or your own daughter? Is the chest of a 4-year-old girl a safe direction? It's not. But it's okay because the gun isn't loaded, right? Even if you were correct about that and had emptied the chamber, what was that other rule? We treat every gun as though it's loaded. Even if I just unloaded it, why do we have that rule? It's stupid. I just unloaded it. Of course it's not loaded. I don't have to treat this gun as loaded. And of course that's internally inconsistent. Can you treat every gun as loaded if you're going to load a gun? Well, no, you can't load a gun that's already loaded. Well, you can put the magazine back in a gun that already has a round in the chamber. But leaving that aside, why do we treat every gun as if it's loaded? Because there could have been a mistake made somewhere along the way. And so we don't point it in an unsafe direction simply because we think it's unloaded, because it may turn out to be loaded and you might kill a 4-year-old who's in your temporary custody. There's a million billion mistakes being made here. And, law-abiding gun owners who are responsible, never make these mistakes until, of course, they do. And that's the reason why you never screw around with this stuff. But, P.S., you actually always screw around with this stuff. Anyway, Runyons pressed the barrel of the gun against the child's chest and pulled the trigger, police said she told them. I mean, I'm glad she was honest with what happened here. But she probably thought, well, they'll understand. I took the magazine out. It doesn't matter. Well, had you ejected the round, you still don't put the barrel of a gun on a 4-year-old's chest or anybody's chest or anybody's foot or anything and pull the trigger. Ever. You just don't. You don't. But she did. Because responsible gun owner, yada, yada, blah, blah, blah. Daniels told the police that she saw Runyons take out the gun, remove its magazine, and put it to Evangeline's chest. This is the other woman with whom she shares the apartment. But she turned away and didn't see her pull the trigger, according to the warrant. Now, obviously, she did pull the trigger. That's how the gun went off. What's amazing is that she saw her girlfriend take out a gun with a 4-year-old, take out the magazine. Okay, that's a good thing to do when you've got a gun around a 4-year-old. And that the next thing she did was put the gun to the 4-year-old's chest, at which point Daniels said, well, she's taken out the magazine, so I can now safely turn and pay attention to something else because safety practices have been adequately practiced here. Safety practices practiced? Yes, you bet. You can excuse the redundancy, I think, in this case. And she said, all's well. The magazine's out. So 2 idiots with 2 children in that house that don't know what they're doing. The girl, 7-year-old girl, then told authorities that she did see Runyons shoot Evangeline. She saw her pull the trigger and said that the bullet also struck a glass bottle, sending shards her way, according to the warrant. The word also doesn't appear in there. I threw that in there because it's otherwise weird and incongruous. I saw her put the gun to the 4-year-old's chest and pull the trigger. And the bullet struck a glass bottle, sending shards her way, according to the warrant. That's dangerous, too. It's endangered the... but amazing, what kind of gets left out there, you're left to assume it yourself, is, well, what we mean is the bullet passed entirely all the way through the chest cavity of the 4-year-old girl. Sorry, everybody. And also hit a glass bottle, which, you're supposed to know where your bullet is going to go, etc. But she didn't think there was a bullet, and so it's okay to press this gun to the 4-year-old's chest. And never mind, I'm not even going to think about the glass bottle behind her because, 1, there's no bullet. 2, surely the bullet will stop in her chest cavity and not endanger that. But I'm not thinking about where the path of the bullet is going because I don't believe there's a bullet. But just a particularly gory way of reminding everybody exactly how crazy this whole situation is. Before the shooting, Evangeline and the older girl, and we just sort of proceed to this matter of factly without any further or any previous discussion, but now back to the temporary custody issue. Before the shooting, Evangeline and the older girl were being punished that morning, not with the weapon, but they were being punished. Why were they being punished? Sounds bad, right? Being punished that morning by Runyons, the shooter, for what? Being too rambunctious, too loud, watching Saturday morning cartoons? No. They were being punished that morning. It must be a normal thing, though, because they're in a temporary custody of these 2 women under some sort of court order, I guess, right? And these are obviously responsible guardians. Apparently they've been maybe taken away somehow from the birth parents, and they're staying with this, or at least one girl is staying with this other family. The other older girl, I guess, is the daughter maybe of the other roommate or something like that. It's explained, well, they're being punished. Surely it's for normal, routine child rearing purposes, right? Well, you might guess that maybe it isn't. After all, this is a household where you do things like 1, teach 4-year-olds firearm safety. 2, forget how to use a gun. 3, press a pistol to the chest of a 4-year-old to show her safety. Which, by the way, in case you were wondering, why would this be involved in teaching a child gun safety? Isn't that the opposite? Remember that one of the rules of gun safety is we don't point the gun at anything that we don't want to kill, and we treat every gun as though it's loaded. I'm going to now teach you gun safety by violating all the rules of gun safety and forgetting around in the chamber and murdering you. Why are we doing this at all? Well, I don't know what has to do with the punishment. Probably nothing. But they were being punished that morning, and I don't know. That doesn't really enter into the situation because the punishment wasn't, I'm going to teach you gun safety as punishment. I mean, presumably teaching somebody gun safety is a reward, right? Safety. It's great. It's a good thing. But anyway, they were being punished that morning for not waking up the women. Not waking up the women. Not playing too loud and you woke me up. Not waking up the women. These two women, I guess they had spent all their money on weapons and they didn't have alarm clocks, I guess, in their house. They had made it the job punishable for any failure of which might ensue. A 4-year-old and a 7-year-old were somehow responsible for, I guess, waking these women up on time to do what? I don't know. Go to their gainful employment after a short lesson in gun safety. Something. But somehow it was the responsibility of a 4-year-old and a 7-year-old to wake these women up. Like, great placement for custody court. Good job on that one. And you're going to be punished if you don't do it right. Because, of course, it's not the adult's responsibility to wake themselves up. They were not supposed to, I guess they're being punished for not waking the women up and for eating Daniels's food without permission, according to the warrant and a statement from Russell Johnson, District Attorney General for Tennessee's 9th Judicial District. Runyons, the punishment came from Runyons. Runyons struck both girls with a sandal before forcing them to stand in different corners of the women's bedroom. Authorities said the older girl told them. Now, you can't be sure that the 7-year-old was recounting everything accurately, but one, being smacked with a sandal, great court placement again. I smack you with a sandal because you didn't wake me up, and you ate her food without permission. I mean, 4 and 7-year-olds, I don't know how much they understand about that. Standing in the corner is sort of standard punishment. Why corners of the women's bedroom as opposed to some other room in the house? I don't know. That's a little strange. Whatever. Maybe it means nothing. The whole thing is a bit of a childcare mess, to say the least. After the shooting, which just happened, I don't know, the women drove Evangeline to a nearby Walmart location. Why? To meet an ambulance. So that's explainable there. Roane County Medical Examiner Dr. Thomas Bowditch told the Roane County News, and the vehicle transported the girl to a hospital where she was pronounced dead. Bowditch could not immediately be reached by HuffPost. Evangeline's mother told WATE, the ABC affiliate there, that she was experiencing a mixture of anger, rage, guilt. Not and guilt, it just says guilt. Following her daughter's death, I can understand that, and was blaming herself for Evangeline being in someone else's care. Probably not entirely off base there. She said that this was the result of a, quote, court decision. We don't know any more about it than that from this article, but you get the idea. But that she'd expected to regain custody soon. Well, that didn't happen. I feel like it's my fault that I let her be there. It sounds like the court thinks so too. Josie Gunter said, I should have been more attentive. Yeah, okay, probably. The Gunters said Evangeline was joyful and always smiling. You know, this is the part of the story where we find out her hopes and dreams. She also wanted to be a cheerleader. So bad. That little girl was cheerleading before she could even walk. But apparently, you know, the Gunters weren't particularly attentive to her beyond noting that she wanted to be a cheerleader because I guess she lost custody of the girl, and to such a place as this. The court in Tennessee is not having, not taking a real close look at where they're placing these kids, apparently. The Tennessee Department of Children's Services confirmed to HuffPost that it had launched an investigation in the case, and officials were also working with law enforcement in the criminal probe. The Gunters said on Facebook that a funeral for Evangeline is planned for Tuesday, September 5th. Following the services, the family will host a birthday party. Evangeline was just about to turn 5 when she was killed. The party, in case you want to know, at Riverfront Park in Harriman, Tennessee. And then, I don't know what to tell you. Like more lamenting of her death. And then finally some closing facts and figures. Runyon on Tuesday waived her right to a bond hearing, and a status hearing is scheduled for September 19th. Her appointed public defender did not respond to a request for comment from HuffPost. She is being held in Roane County Jail on a bond of $1.5 million. That's amazing that her bond for that is $1.5 million. What was the bond for Trump again for trying to overthrow the entirety of the United States democracy? I think it was $200,000, right? And he's got how much more money? I don't know what to tell you about bond in this country. Experts say guns are a leading cause of death for children and teens in the U.S. Did you know that? The American Public Health Association said gun violence is a public health crisis in the country. Nearly 29,000 people have died from gun violence so far in 2023, according to data from the Gun Violence Archive. So there you have it. There is other reporting from other sources here, but we won't have time to get into all of that. In fact, it's time for us to exit the entire situation at this point, show and all. But the Smart News one has a picture of Brianna Runyons, in case you are interested in seeing her. Everybody else went with the tugging at the heartstrings, showing this poor 4-year-old girl who had been the victim in this case. I don't know. And besides which, I can't read you the Smart News story without downloading the Smart News app, so I'll be avoiding that one entirely. But you can, at least if you want, I'll include the link so that you can see who is this person who keeps guns around and decides on her own volition that while she's got temporary custody of a 4-year-old by virtue of a court order, 1, she needs to be smacked with a sandal, 2, she needs to be punished for not waking her up, and 3, needs to learn about gun safety at all for any reason whatsoever from an idiot like this who doesn't actually know how to practice gun safety. I don't know any better than anybody else. I just learn from the experience of reading about the mistakes of others. And so mine is a textbook knowledge, not a street smarts knowledge of practicing gun safety. What can I tell you? All right. Lots of other things we didn't get to, but it gives me lots of ideas of things I might record for you later or share with you next week, even if we're not on live on Labor Day when we return. But you know who's live next? It's Justice Putnam with the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy right here on Netroots Radio. All you need to do is stay tuned to the live stream you're listening to right now. Unless you're listening to podcast, of course.
Listening to Kagro in the morning.
In which case,
David Waldman.
You will need to make your way to his podcast. And what will you be hearing when you get there? Well, there's more about Clarence Thomas and Harlan Crow, of course. And then locally speaking, police chief in Tillamook, Oregon was arrested for stealing drugs and cash from the evidence locker. That's the place to find it. Why do you rob banks? That's where the money is. Why do you steal your drugs from the evidence locker? See you next week.